So we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to this semester's Anthro Stories Occasional Speaker Series. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Professor Panagakos, Professor of Anthropology here at CRC. And we're really excited to have you all here today and to have our two panelists talking about forensic anthropology. And so before we get to that, just a few things. I wrote them down, otherwise I will forget. Anthro Stories is an occasional speaker series which highlights the academic, career, and personal journeys of anthropologists who are working and learning here in Northern California. And the goal of Anthro Stories is to give our students and the broader community exposure to the varied and diverse perspectives found in anthropology. It's a discipline which studies the whole experience of what it means for us to be human, everything from our present day to ancient societies, our biology, our evolution, our language, and also our culture. And before we get a little bit deeper into that, I also want to read our campus land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land currently occupied by Cosumnes River College as the traditional home of the Miwok and Nisenan people. These sovereign people have been caretakers of the area since time immemorial. The state of California is home to more than 110 federally recognized Indian tribes, representing the most diverse set of tribal nations anywhere in the United States. Despite centuries of genocide and occupation, the Miwok and Nisenan people continue as vibrant and resilient, federally recognized tribes, bands, and rancherias. The waters of the Sacramento, American, and Cosumnes rivers have nourished Miwok and Nisenan tribal communities with cultural and dietary sustenance throughout time. Cosumnes of Cosumnes River derives from the Plains Miwok language, stemming from the words Kusumu, meaning salmon, and Umne, meaning the place of. It translates as the place of the salmon. Today we celebrate our Miwok and Nisenan tribal neighbors as the ancestral stewards of this land and honor their sustained existence. It is with their blessing and continued guidance that Cosumnes River College seeks to provide an accessible, equitable, and principled institution of learning. So before we begin the presentation today, I just want to remind everyone, if you could please silence your cell phones and be sure that they're put away during the presentation. Photography and video recording are not allowed during the presentation. And also, this is being recorded from the back of the room, just so you know. It will be available on YouTube. We have a playlist of all the Anthro stories we've done in the past. So I'll throw up a QR code at the end if you're interested in seeing some of those as well. And so this will be available probably in a week or so. If you are attending for extra credit, please be sure to sign your name in the sign-in sheet in the back of the room too, so we can let your professor know that you are here. Okay, one more just housekeeping item. Before I introduce the panelists, just a little heads up. The way that we'll run this is I have like a few questions to ask Thomas and Paige to begin with, just to get them talking about their experiences, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers if you have them. Also, we will be ending around 11:40 because there is another event in this room at 12. Women's History Month kicks off at 12, so it's a full day here at CRC. So we'll be ending a little bit early, and Paige and Thomas have graciously said that they will accompany me over to the Anthro Lab, so if you have questions and want to continue talking to them, they'll stick around for a little bit after that. So we'll try to end here by about, 11:40. So a couple things, let's see, where are we? So I want to introduce Thomas and Paige first and then tell you a little bit about where they came from in terms of their academic training. And so Thomas is a queer and Latin scholar that completed their BA at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and their MA at California State University, Chico. Their research interests include the use of stable isotopes and machine learning to estimate region of origin from unidentified remains, as well as ethics and accessibility related to forensic anthropology. They've held roles supporting student engagement within the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and are currently employed by a local cultural resource management firm supporting a large archaeological investigation in downtown Sacramento. You're going to have to tell us more about machine learning because I know I had to ask you about that because I had no idea. I'm like, Thomas, what is that? Paige Schmitt is a first-generation college student at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. She received her BA from West Virginia University in anthropology and criminology before moving to Chico to pursue a master's degree. Her academic interests are primarily in bioarchaeology and how our lived experiences become embodied in our skeletons. Paige's thesis research is an extension of this interest as she uses a lens of structural violence to interpret non-specific skeletal indicators of stress among archaic Greek individuals from a site in Athens. Additionally, at Chico, she has worked as an assistant for tribal relations to aid in the rehousing and repatriation of ancestors and cultural objects. In the long term, she would like to continue to work in repatriation, and outside of school and work, Paige enjoys hiking and crocheting. So Paige and Thomas were trained at Chico State Anthropology's Human Identification Lab, which is a cutting-edge facility that provides hands-on training to law enforcement agencies and personnel, responds to disasters, including initial search and rescue and recovery after wildfires, and is engaged in ongoing projects with the Department of Defense involving repatriation of veteran remains of U.S. soldiers killed or missing in action. The highly regarded graduate program in forensic anthropology prepares students to work in a variety of lab settings and has a 100% post-graduation job placement rate. So something that not a lot of programs can live up to, so that's pretty exciting. So with that in mind, please give a round of applause and welcome our guests. So thank you again, Paige and Thomas, for being here. Yeah, really excited. So the other thing that Chico does is they have a forensics conference every fall that's actually run by the graduate students. And it's free, which is a bonus. But it's a great way to learn about forensic anthropology, so that might be something to think about also talking about. But that's where I actually first encountered Paige and Thomas was last fall attending the Chico Forensic Conference, which was just an amazing experience to hear about the kind of work that people do. So with that, maybe we'll kind of tag team maybe. So for both of you, just the question of a little bit about your background and how you found anthropology, because I think for a lot of us, it's not until we take an anthropology class that we have any idea of what that even is. And so if you could tell us a little bit about your journey as to where you started and how you found this discipline. So Paige, we'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, so I completed my undergraduate education at West Virginia University, and I guess you're kind of wondering, well, how did what? I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and West Virginia University was one of the only universities with an accredited forensic science program that was close to where I was from in Pennsylvania, and that's how I ended up there. But as you can tell, I found anthropology not easily at first. I enjoyed the forensic science coursework. It was a lot of chemistry, biology, but not much to do with people. And I realized that I was very much interested in people and science together and not so separated. And I ended up taking an anthropology class to fulfill one of the general education requirements for my degree. And I realized, oh, this is what I want to do. So that's how I figured out that I wanted to pursue anthropology, and more specifically forensic anthropology and bioarchaeology. And as an undergraduate, I also worked as a research assistant for the forensic science department, and it was one of the most challenging things I've done because I wasn't continuing to pursue the higher level forensic coursework, but I was still helping with research projects, and that was how I was able to finish my degree in undergrad, because I had a paid position, and I would not have been able to stay enrolled in college if I wasn't working at the same time. So it was really great to be able to find work on campus, and since I remained involved in forensic science, one of my advisors in undergrad was like, oh, you should look into forensic science or forensic anthropology master's programs, and recommended I apply to Chico. And that's how I found myself here 3 years later, finishing up my degree in Chico. Yeah, and I can talk more about my osteology training later if anyone is more interested in that. But that's just kind of an overview of how I ended up in Chico.
Yeah, and I'm also from the other side of the country. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee. I did my bachelor's of anthropology of arts at Knoxville, Tennessee University, Tennessee, Knoxville. My history with anthropology really starts when I was a kid. I grew up in semi-rural Knoxville, Tennessee, and my grandfather was actually one of the first homicide detectives in Knoxville in the 70s, right when Dr. Bill Bass was actually moving from, I think it was Arkansas at the time, to Knoxville to start the anthropological research facility, or the body farm, which he would then do like 10 years after he started working with the Knoxville Sheriff's Department. So my grandfather, I grew up hearing stories from my grandfather about his work with Dr. Bass and all the interesting, more explicit details of those stories, such as when he would ask, when Dr. Bass would ask for a hand, and he literally meant a hand, and my grandfather would hand him a hand. They worked on serial killer cases, throughout the 70s and 80s. There are still inmates that my grandfather put behind bars that are sitting there on death row. So that's how I started kind of gaining my interest in forensics, but I didn't know what forensic anthropology was. I didn't know what forensic anthropology was until I was a junior in college. I had known all about it growing up, but I didn't know anything about anthropology, and the way that university systems treat their students, especially incoming freshmen, is not very good. You're bounced around a lot of different advisors, and none of those advisors are in the department you're really probably going to end in. So I spent a lot of my first 2 years not knowing anything about anthropology until I eventually joined the department formally my junior year. After that, I underwent a lot of the same kind of osteological training, forensic anthropology training. I did work at the body farm as well during my undergrad, did some light undergraduate research, working in labs, doing skeletal analysis, and then just basically lending a hand where I could. So after I did another 2.5 years within the anthropology department, I did take another semester to graduate past the standard 4-year role, which is a hard thing to do anyway. So after that, I did not get into any master's programs. My first year, I was rejected flat out. It's what happens a lot of the times. I only graduated with a 2.9 GPA because of issues my first 2 years, which I'm more than welcome to get into if it comes up. It was something that we had mentioned earlier. So I was not really fit for a graduate education based on those application requirements. I did pretty well in the GRE, only for the next year the GRE not to matter, which is a very good thing. It's a good thing the GRE doesn't matter anymore, because it was an awful exam that cost me way too much money. So after not getting in, I started working at the Forensic Anthropology Center, which is affiliated with the Anthropological Research Facility, or the Body Farm, with Dr. Donnie Wolf Stedman as my main mentor. And it was kind of at that point that she sat me down and asked me what I'm actually trying to do with forensics. She was like, it's cool that your grandfather worked with Dr. Bass and all, but what does that actually mean for you? And that's when I started getting into my other grandparents' history, because my Mexican side of the family is on my dad's side in southern Arizona, and my grandfather and my grandmother both migrated undocumented for about a decade from Mexico to California, Texas, and then finally settling in southern Arizona. So I started thinking about how to give back to that community, because that family has always done that for the undocumented community in their area. So thinking about that got me into questions about migration, which got me into questions about diasporas, which got me into questions into structural violence, in a similar vein as what Paige will talk about, I'm sure, but apply to more migration crises specifically. And that's when I started developing my interest in stable isotope analysis to help identify deceased migrants from one of the world's deadliest borders. And to do that, I was recommended to work with Dr. Eric Bartelink at Chico, who is one of the world's foremost stable isotope forensic anthropologists. So I moved all the way from Knoxville after working for the FAC for a year, which was apparently enough to get me into a graduate program at Chico. So I ended up leaving Knoxville after my first year, getting into Chico, and then going there literally just for one person. And it seemed to be the right idea. I finished.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions. So So Paige, did you start off by going into anthropology? Like, did you know you wanted to study anthropology when you were a freshman? Because I know that I heard this, a colleague once told me that on average, college students change their majors 4 to 5 times. So if you're out there thinking to yourselves, I've already changed it twice, well, you're still, way below the curve. So most students do change their major many times before they settle on something. So was anthro what you intended to do when you started?
No. No, I like Thomas, didn't hear about didn't have forensic anthropology explained to me until I was probably also in my junior year of undergrad. At that time, I had already realized, I'm kind of interested in anthro, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, I went to WVU specifically for the forensic science program. I thought I wanted to work in a lab doing like chemistry and different kinds of analyses like that. I had no idea that I wanted to do anthropology. I really didn't realize it until I had finished almost my whole freshman year. And I was like, like the classes I'm taking are okay, but I feel like I'm missing something. And I ended up talking to a couple different advisors because you do get bounced around a lot. And they were like, oh, why don't you try taking a criminology class? And so I ended up taking a few sociology and criminology classes. And I was like, okay, I really am very interested in how our society and our environments influence us and how they negatively and disproportionately impact some people. And I was like, this is what I'm interested in. And then I took an anthropology class to fulfill another general education requirement. And I was like, this is what ties it all together. And so I added anthropology as a major, and I continued taking both anthropology classes and also sociology and criminology classes, because I felt like I finally had something to tie together my love for science and osteology and people, and then also the cultural aspects of those things.
Thank you. And I do want you actually both to talk a little bit about the challenges you might have faced as undergraduates. Again, I think it's good for all of us to know that it's not easy going through the process, whether you're starting at community college or starting at a 4-year. But before that, Thomas, could you tell us a little bit more for folks who may not know what the body farm is? Because body farm sounds like, well, what it sounds like. So tell us a little more about that, please.
Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of a body farm, it is just an outdoor decomposition facility that does human-mediated decomposition. So we, it takes over about 3, I think we just got a slight expansion to 3.5 acres of land outside of the University Medical Center. It's forested, and we get in human donors. We probably got in, usually when I was there, we got in about 200 human donors a year. That works up a lot of donors, a lot of people that come through UT. And then they basically undergo a sample collection process and documentation in our lab before moving into a cooler, and then we take them and we actually place them outside at our decomposition facility in various, I guess, states of situation, but probably not as extreme as what you're thinking. Back in the day, they used to put people in like car trunks and cars and like submersion or hanging from gallows, things of that nature, which gives this kind of really grotesque sense to the work. It's not that grotesque, it's really scientific, and they don't do a lot of those kind of situational things anymore because the research has already been done. But we basically take them, they just get placed supine on the ground. Most of them are covered in black plastic, black tarping to encourage insect activity and to also keep it private from drones, helicopters, things of that nature, because everyone knows it's there. If you're in Knoxville and know a Knoxville local, every single person will say it is right up the road, right there, and they all know where it is. So made working there interesting. I got a lot of weird, random people knocking on my office door saying, can I get a tour of the body farm? No is always the answer. Does that answer that question? Pretty, yeah.
And then Thomas, if you want to start by talking about maybe a little bit about undergraduate challenges or that sort of thing, or opportunities. I mean, the good and the bad.
Undergrad was a lot of good and bad. Probably about even 50-50 split. So my first 2 years of my undergraduate experience, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I knew forensic anthropology, didn't know anything about it. And working in, especially like an R1 institute, like the University of Tennessee or like UC Davis, any of those big institutional institutions, you get bounced around a lot. There's not a lot of support for students in those areas. There's a lot of weed out classes. It's ironic now that I am an isotope chemist when I couldn't pass my general chemistry courses at UT. I made 2 C's and a D on Chem 101 and 102. And saying I've done chemistry for the military now. Oh, how times change. But my first 2 years of undergrad, I was houseless and semi-transient. A lot of the time I was working 2 to 3 jobs at any one point, 40 to 60 hours a week, while taking anywhere from an 18 to a 20 credit hour course load those first 2 years. I had some family issues that really just exploded as soon as I graduated high school. I went straight from high school to a 4-year university. Mistake. Community college is a very undervalued resource in our social climate, and I think that is a shame. Because what I went through, it's just not fair for a lot of other people to have to go through the same thing. So those first 2 years, I couldn't pass a class. I couldn't feed myself. I barely got enough sleep. I would basically go from like 6 o'clock in the morning to about 2 o'clock in the morning, working again, maybe 1, 2, 3 jobs, doing all my courses, doing my homework, writing my essays. Obviously, you don't thrive well under those conditions. So by the time I hit my junior year, I had lost all of my scholarship opportunities that I had. I lost my first scholarship my first semester because of that, which only makes you poorer. So a lot of things could have happened in that area that could have been beneficial. I could have dropped out, gone to community college. I could have reprioritized my goals in life, but I decided I was going to graduate with this degree. I was going to finish my bachelor's at this university. No one can stop me. And by the time I hit junior year, a lot of that bad from my first 2 years had became pretty stable. For a multitude of reasons, I was able to move back in with my father. So I actually was able to have secure housing for the last 2.5 years that I was in undergrad. I was able to cut down my jobs to 1 full-time job. I've never worked less than 40 hours a week, I think, ever. And it gave me a lot of opportunities that I'm really thankful for. Like, my true enjoyment in college didn't come until my junior and senior plus years, where I got to do lab work. I got to actually have mentors. I got to have people that cared about me and not just some university advisor that's going to see another 80 students right after me. And I got a lot of support through that. So all of the good that really came out of my university is from community. And I think all of the good that has come out throughout the rest of my career has really come from community. Lab spaces are communities. Conferences can be communities. Universities can be communities if you have the resources to make it that way. And that could be social, financial, or just geographical, where you actually at resources. But just being able to work with mentors and people and to form your own community, I think really got me as far as I could get. It got me here.
Similar to Thomas, I think community has a lot to do with how I've been able to complete my undergraduate degree, and now am in the process of completing my graduate one, because as was mentioned, I'm a first-generation college student. None of my parents, my grandparents, my immediate family have gone to college, and so I really was completely lost graduating high school and starting at a 4-year institution. I thought it was my only option to move out of my hometown and pursue a career that I wanted to. And if I would have known then what I know now, I probably would have done things differently. But I think it's worked out for the most part. When I was in high school, I worked and I was saving a lot of money because I knew I wanted to go to college, but I really wouldn't have been able to pursue an undergraduate degree if I wasn't offered a scholarship at my undergraduate institution. It just wouldn't have been a reality if I didn't have financial support from the university. And that is actually how I ended up with the research position I mentioned. I was awarded federal work study as part of my financial aid package, and I found out that, oh, you can apply to research assistant jobs at WVU with that. And really, that is why I was able to stay enrolled in college. I wouldn't have been able to do so without working. And there was a moment before the start of my junior year where I thought I was going to have to withdraw or take at least a semester, if not a whole year off, because they had, I think as with most institution goes, there's budget issues. And so they ended up cutting the position that I was working for, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't go back, because I didn't have a car at the time, so I had to be able to work on campus, or else I wouldn't have been able to stay in Morgantown. And I knew for certain that I had 2 jobs in my hometown in Pennsylvania, and I was like, I know that these are guaranteed. I don't know what I'm going to be able to get if I go back to college. And it was really with the support of my mentor, who had been my supervisor on the research project that had been working on the previous 2 years, that I was able to go back, because we had a lot of long conversations, and I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I know I really want to finish this degree, but it's just not realistic if I don't have guaranteed employment. And she was very supportive, very helpful, and was able to secure grant funding to continue my job for the 2 years I had left at the university. And through that, we ended up talking, and I ended up getting a second job as a tutor with the university as well. And that's really the only reason I was able to finish undergrad, was through her support, and then the support of my peers, my friends in the department that I had made. Because if not, I probably would have ended up staying in Pennsylvania for at least a year or 2, and would have taken time off during my undergraduate degree, which of course there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm just thankful that I was able to continue pursuing what I wanted to do.
Well, thank you for that. First of all, thank you for the shout out for community colleges. We're big fans here of the community college system. And the idea of your experiences shaping both, I mean, they're challenges, but they're also opportunities that then come by going through those challenges is really appreciated. And also, I mean, just thinking about the fact that not all college careers are linear or go in one direction, that, you know, for all students really to be thinking about how a year off may be what is the right thing, or it's okay to stop and come back. And I think those are really good reminders, because I know we're oftentimes forced into thinking that the path is one way and it's linear, but as we've said, there's lots of ways to get to the end goal. So I would love for both of you to talk about your interests in anthropology, so in the kinds of work that you did for your master's. Thomas, I'm going to pick a little bit on you, because you mentioned stable isotopes, which as someone who also got a C in chemistry and then said, that's it, I'm never taking another science class again, and I'm going into cultural anthropology, I can kind of appreciate this sort of the effect that hard science can have on some people. So stable isotopes, I've heard a lot about stable isotopes, but just in the anthropology circles that I run, but maybe if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit first about your interests in the kind of forensic work you do, but then also how something like the sciencey part of things and what stable isotopes actually are, what they can tell you about people, and the way that they live their lives. So if you want to maybe start there, and then Paige, if you want to also talk about your research, we'll continue.
matter, space. So the real premise of isotopic analysis is that the environment around us becomes ingrained in our bodies, in our tissues, whether that's hair, nail, bone, skin, any living tissue. The environment that we live in will eventually become part of us as well. And we can see that through the different amounts of elements that are in these tissues. So if you have more of carbon 12 versus more of and less of carbon 13, what? Am I just loud? Oh. It's like, so if you basically have these different ratios of isotopes, it can tell you different things about things like someone's diet, someone's health, someone's stresses, and then most importantly for what I personally look into, someone's travel and migration patterns. So the main elements that I use when it comes to migration patterns is going to be strontium, hydrogen, oxygen, and lead. I haven't done a lot with lead. Lead is one of the newer ones that's coming out, but that has shown to be really good for migration and provenancing studies. Provenancing just means estimating where something's from. And then you can also do things into insights of diet, which you can see through different ratios of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and nitrogen. You can look at aspects of health through looking at different nitrogen ratios. You can look at aspects of maternal weaning. When do babies stop breastfeeding? You can see that through things like nitrogen isotope ratios. So you can really get a lot of useful insights just based on the chemical composition of people. So my thesis research basically was looking at how we can use stable isotopes to classify other isotope ratios throughout Mexico to Colombia. So I basically separated out Mexico to Colombia with it to 6 different regions because the scale of isotopic provenancing is not very high. Like within the United States, where most of the isotopic research has been done, we're lucky if we can tell you if it's generally from the Pacific Northwest or maybe the Southwest or maybe all the way up around the mountain ranges up to like North and South Dakota. That all has very similar isotopic composition than like this upper central Midwestern states. So the resolution, the scale that we can actually place people in is not very great. So I was trying to think of ways that we can make that scale a bit higher resolution. So yeah, so anyway, I separated out from Mexico to Colombia to 6 different geographic regions, and then I trained 6 different machine learning algorithms, which are just basically ways that you can make computers think kind of like people, to see if I can use these different algorithms, these different statistics, these different methods to increase that isotopic resolution for provenancing. And the main one that I was looking at was the artificial neural network. I used a simple artificial neural network called the multi-layer perceptron, which basically just, you get a lot of input data and then it feeds it through several different layers of nodes of weights that self-adjust to each other before classifying it into one of those 6 different regions. The process is complicated and it helps if you have visuals. I don't have visuals, so you'll just have to look into this more yourself. Or if you come to the lab afterwards, I can show you visuals of it on my phone. And basically it just showed that with more robust machine learning techniques, you can actually increase the resolution of isotopic provenancing, the neural network achieving the best rates of that classification, which is exactly what I was hoping for. So my thesis was a success. I have a question. Okay.
Just a follow-up question, because it's very interesting thinking about how, like you were saying, how like basically the environment is inscribed in our bodies based on where we grew up and what we ate, and stable isotopes helps us understand that in both bone and teeth. Is that correct?
Yes, bone, any living tissue. So
Any living
bone, teeth, hair, nails are the most common tissues, but you technically can use like your epithelial skin cells as well.
So for example, trying to work it backward from my layman's perspective. So for example, if you are a forensic anthropologist who, let's say, is assisting border folks who are coming across the border, undocumented people, and you find human remains, right? Is that, and stop me when I get this wrong. So you find, you're assisting, let's say you find only skeletal remains, it's a body that's been out there for a long time. And so you can use stable isotope analysis to figure out potentially where that person originated from.
Yes. So focusing on the skeletal example, bone is about a 10-year recorder of your history, which means if you pick up a hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, whatever element signal from 10 years ago, that's probably what's in your bones right now. So if someone came from, say, like Guatemala, their isotope ratios, you know, from that time spent in Guatemala is going to stay in their bone even after they cross the border, unless they stay in the United States for 10 to 15 years. But when it comes to teeth are formed during childhood. So wherever you grew up in childhood, basically those first 8 to 10 years before your adult teeth come in, that will always be the isotopic ratio that's present in your teeth. So if we're looking at migrants that come by, teeth, I love teeth. Teeth are my favorite things. I want everyone to be able to just give me their teeth, because they're such good recorders of your isotopic signatures from birth. Anyway, if you want to talk to me about teeth later, I can talk about teeth. I got distracted thinking about teeth. Wow, I lost my train of thought thinking about teeth.
So just to, I'm going to regurgitate just a little bit, because I find, okay, sorry. Because I just find that so fascinating that you could have, so an individual, so let's say you have a person who was born and raised in Guatemala, and so as your teeth are being formed in your little head, right, they put down the isotopes and the signature of whatever was in the environment that you were there. Usually water is one of the ones.
Water is what I use for my
Water is
thesis.
what you use, right. And so, but then let's say you grew up and you started migrating north, and maybe you spent 10 years in Mexico, which is not where you're from, but you spent some time there, and then you decided, I'm going to make that leap into the United States, met unfortunate circumstances, and let's say you died. You would still have the signature of where, in their teeth, of where that person was born, which was Guatemala, not the last place they were, which is Mexico. Although you might be able...
But the bone will probably show a Mexican isotopic signature. But the teeth will always retain that childhood signature.
Yeah.
Can I take questions, right?
Yeah, of course. Did you want a follow-up question on that?
More.
So the question is, could there potentially be more than one isotope?
So we always I always advocate for looking at multiple different isotopes, and when it comes to, I think maybe what you're getting at is what we refer to as intra-individual variation, which is just a fancy way of saying that maybe the ratio from my ulna is going to be different from the isotopic ratio in my femur. And that is a very real thing, because bone turns over at different rates, and we don't have the physics and the mechanics of bone turnover patterned very well at this moment. So yes, you can have multiple different bones will have the potential to reflect different isotopic signatures, easy. But your teeth will always record the ones from history. But you can use your tooth root. So the tooth enamel is specifically what I'm talking about when I say for childhood. You can use the tooth root. Teeth roots also turn over like bone. So you can use that as another like shorter term recorder. And then when it comes to expanding on this a little bit, when it comes to your hair and nails are what we refer to as short-term recorders. They pick up where you're at pretty quick. So we can actually seriate out hair and nails. Seriate just means basically I cut it into smaller pieces, and then I can look at a chronological pattern of travel. It's not foolproof. It's cool, but for example, strontium comes from the bedrock and the earth. Strontium really contaminates remains. So for example, if you're in Mexico with a strontium isotope signature in your hair, and then you go to New York, after like 2 weeks in New York, your strontium isotope signature in your hair will be different. But we can see that patterning. So I did an isotope course in Utah, at the University of Utah, with Dr. Gabriel Bowen, called Spatial. If anyone's interested in isotopes and goes to grad school, Spatial is a great course at Utah. Gabe is one of the preeminent isotopic geophysicists in the world. He's great. But they did a lot of research into that. So they actually have a Chinese example of a Chinese visitor whose hair shows that they're in China, and then they get to Salt Lake, and their isotope ratios drop to be more in line with Salt Lake. So yeah, so you can see different stuff like that, and different tissues and different parts of the body can give different insights into it as well.
Thank you. And is it a follow-up question? Go ahead.
It's a little different. First of all, I really appreciate the work that you're doing for the faculty.
Thank you.
That's very versatile.
Same.
But how did you separate into those 6 categories, the different sort of isotopes across sort of Latin America? And how did you get the idea of machine learning in the process?
So the separation of the regions was all based geographically on things like isthmuses. Sometimes it was borders, tropics. So it was these map breaks. The isotopic patterning is very, 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 very nuanced, because you have to think these are things that are changing gradually over space and also over time. So it's a very gradual, simple change most of the time, which gets into that next question of, well, then why machine learning? Because a lot of anthropology's current methods for statistical analysis, not just in isotopes, as a whole, are pretty lackluster. They rely on things like Euclidean distance, k-nearest neighbor analysis, linear regression, discriminant function, which is discriminant function's another linear regression most of the time. So these aren't very robust statistical techniques that are really able to take out these really nuanced patterns in our data set. And don't get me wrong, k-nearest neighbors and Euclidean distance analysis, that is an aspect of machine learning. It has its applications, but when it comes to these really nuanced or big, like I had 3,000 data points that I analyzed, which we can get into how that is done after this. That's a long process. Yeah, so machine learning was my thought, because we just aren't very robust in our analytical methods. So what better way to talk about how lackluster some of our analytical methods are than to use some really emergent technologies in that practice. And I did not, I kind of know how to code. I used a computer scientist. I think it's really important for students to be able to understand or read the code, understand how the code works, know how to run the code. Could I have coded it myself from scratch? Absolutely not. Do I know what it says though? Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. And so, Paige, let's bring in your research interests. And you were looking at structural violence among an archaic Greek population. And so I was wondering if you could first tell us a little bit about, or maybe defining a little bit what structural violence is, and then how it applied to the individuals that you were looking at. And when we say archaic Greeks, I'm a modern Greek, so when we're talking about archaic Greeks, what time period are we talking about?
Yes, okay. So similar to Thomas, I'm interested in how things become embodied in our skeletons. However, I'm looking at it in a very different, in a very different way than isotopic analysis. I'm interested in structural violence, which is a term used to describe inequality that can impact health, life outcomes, but not just physically, but also mentally, especially when talking about modern populations. Those things can be evaluated. But when we're looking in the past, I'm really looking at different paleopathological conditions that are indicative of some kind of stress event. However, these skeletal and dental indicators can't necessarily be attributed to one specific disease, and that's why they're called nonspecific. And when you look at different rates of nonspecific indicators in populations, you can see, the goal is to see if there's any pattern. Are there specific groups of this population that are disproportionately affected by these conditions? And that's where structural violence theory comes in, because I am using that to interpret the patterns that I'm seeing. And when thinking about my work in Greece, the population, or I shouldn't say population, archaeological groups are never a reflection of the whole population. It's kind of like a snapshot over a period of time. But anyways, the individuals I'm looking at are from the Faleron Cemetery, which is along the Bay of Faleron in Athens. And they date to the Archaic period, which is roughly 2,000 years ago. So I'm looking at individuals from 800 BC to about 480 BC, so a long time ago. Not much research has been published yet on the Faleron Cemetery. There will be a few, I don't know if anyone's gone to the AABAs, but I'm sure a few other people who are working on the project are presenting there, and hopefully there will be some more research published soon. But the general thought is that these people were likely not affluent or wealthy members of Athenian society, because if you look at other Archaic period cemeteries, you see like monumental architecture, a wealth of like grave goods placed with the individuals, and we just don't see any of that at Faleron. So it's very different than other more well-studied Archaic period cemeteries in Athens. So I'm interested in seeing if that kind of disparity in wealth is correlated with class status, and thus like the lived experiences of these individuals. So that's why I'm looking at non-specific indicators of stress. I'm interested in how prevalent they are, and then whether or not within the Faleron Cemetery, if there's any differences in prevalence between the different sections of time in the Archaic period. So there's a group of burials that we think are from an earlier period in the Archaic, and then there's a group that's from a little bit later in the Archaic period. So I'm wondering if there's any difference in the prevalence rates, because as we progress throughout the Archaic period in Athens, different class statuses based on wealth were really becoming defined and integrated into like different law codes. So I'm wondering how that is reflected in the people who are likely not that wealthy. And I think researching this in bioarchaeology is very important because it displays significant time depth to structural violence, and I think it can serve to denaturalize the health consequences we're seeing today. Like this is the patterning of disease and malnutrition and so on is not inherently normal or natural. It's very much shaped by our societies and how we as individuals are situated in them.
Thank you, Paige. So just a follow-up question to that. So thinking about the idea that, if I'm hearing you correctly, so in this time period, what you're seeing is actually Athenian society becoming more stratified. So differences between a wealthier class and a poorer class, which is something, of course, that very much interests us today when we think about structural violence and disproportionately impacted communities. And you can go to any cemetery in our area and see the differences between folks who had a lot of money and the monuments they put up to themselves or have put up for them, as opposed to folks who don't. So in the Athenian context from the Archaic period, what would be some of the things that you would see in skeletal remains that would indicate structural violence? Like when you mention number of individuals, are you talking like 10 individuals, 100? Like, give us a sense of how many people we're talking about.
Yeah, okay. So for my thesis specifically, I'm looking at Cribro-orbitalia, linear enamel hypoplasias, which are in the teeth, and then periostral reactions, and oh my gosh, now I'm gonna blank on my thesis, I'm nervous. And carious lesions in the teeth as well. So Cribro-orbitalia and linear enamel hypoplasias are conditions that occur during childhood. So similar to isotopes with nonspecific indicators of stress, you can get a picture into what people experienced
during growth and development and also later in life. So the later, quote unquote, later in life markers I'm looking at are the carious lesions, which are just cavities, and then generalized periostal reactions of the tibia. And yeah, so I'm looking at those specifically. However, with structural violence in bioarchaeology, people use a variety of different indicators. These are just the 4 that I chose to focus on for my thesis, and I think they're some of the most common that you'll encounter in the research. And then number of individuals wise, the Faleron Cemetery includes over 1,000 individuals, but for my thesis, I certainly am not, it's not possible for me to collect that much data. So I'm using a sample from all of those individuals, and I think in the end, it'll probably be hopefully around 80 individuals total that I'll be looking at. But of course, ideally, I would have as many as possible. So I'm looking forward to when data collection for the entire project will be done, because it will be very interesting to be able to look at that for the entire group rather than just a sample of the cemetery.
And kind of building on what Paige has said about, you can, like, isotopes can kind of tell you something about, there is nothing stopping anyone from doing research that looks at both.
Yes.
You know, the intersections and the multidisciplinary nature of anthropology is only going to keep moving forward. It'll continue being a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary field. So there's nothing wrong with looking at linear enamel hypoplasias and nitrogen values. If you wanted to do something like that for a thesis or independent research, you definitely could.
Yes, interdisciplinary research is definitely, I think, vital for the field moving forward. And I also think it's, for yourself, of course, it's great if you do both and want to do both, but I think it's also okay if you focus on one thing, because that's the best thing about community. You can have other people help you out when you need more insight from areas that are not necessarily your area of expertise.
Yeah, science definitely does not happen in a vacuum, and anyone that says that they did all of their research by themselves with no outside support is a liar.
Yeah.
Maybe not like 30 years ago, but today, like, definitely. I mean, I haven't seen, you know, like, truly independent, like, research developed in a professional way in my career, definitely. So there's nothing wrong with asking for help from other people that are specialized in other things, because I definitely do it all the time.
It seems like that's definitely one of the strengths of coming to forensics from an anthropological perspective, is you really are drawing from so many different, not just the sort of hard science, the chemistry, the osteology, but then also the behavioral side of things. Lest we forget, we're dealing with people who actually had lives and behaviors and patterns and things that they did. So I appreciate that. So I want to be sure we have enough time for questions. And so there may be a question or two out in the audience, and so we'll start this way and move that way. So if you want to say your question, then I'll repeat it or you can say it.
This one's for Thomas. I was wondering how you find being queer in this field, if it's any more easy or difficult than other fields of work.
I will say it's really funny you mentioned that. So I just came back from the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting in Denver, where I made a new friend from Australia, a very nice friend. And his exact words to me is, "Wow, is there any straight people in forensic anthropology?" The answer is, it can be a challenge. It definitely can be a real challenge, depending on, you know, what communities you're in, what spaces you're in, or just even who you're talking to. I had issues with it while I was in grad school. Not even 3 years ago, I had to, you know, have some words about defending being a non-binary and queer individual. So it can be hard. It can be frustrating. In the academic world, I have not had that many issues with it. In the professional world, as like an archaeologist, that I typically just don't bring it up. Does that answer the question sufficiently good?
I had a question for both of you. I kind of goes hand in hand. I was wondering, could you use isotopes to track microplastic consumption in people, as well as can you use structural violence to see the effects of microplastic consumption on the human body in like a modern era?
Hey, you might have a thesis. I would say, I guess from like a theoretical perspective, looking at the isotopic effects, plastic's not technically an organic material, so I don't know how well that material would then translate its atomic identity to the body, since it's not being metabolized in any way. Yeah, I think that's kind of my answer. I don't really think it would have a big impact because plastics can't be metabolized, unless there's some doctors in the room that disagree with that statement. I don't think plastics can be metabolized.
Well, I know that microplastics can increase estrogen levels in the body.
I don't know. That's really interesting. I have not seen any papers or research that discusses that in people. I know that there are some papers in like marine biology that I've seen with microplastics and then maybe their effects on like DNA and stuff, but I'm not a marine biologist, so I can't say I've read them. You posed a very interesting question. Structural violence.
Yeah, I think like structural violence as a broad theory, you can kind of apply to anything, and I think it probably should be applied to most things in society. So if we're thinking about like microplastics and structural violence, I would probably ask whether or not there's segments of the population that are like disproportionately impacted by like lower quality foods and drinks and things like that, that would then result in microplastics.
I guess when it comes to structural violence, it's important that you're working truly as there is a group and then there is a structure, and a structure is affecting a group. So if microplastics are, say, globalized in basically everyday society, that might be a difficult thing to get at with structural violence. But if it has to do with quality of foods, food stuff, access to foods, then you can definitely address that structure of the generation of waste to those effects on a subset of people, whether that subset is just those that are poorer, lower socioeconomic status. People undergo structural violence every day. So it could be anything as broad as just that to as narrow as like Latino migration.
This is for Paige. I feel like you kind of already covered this, so I apologize if I'm having you repeat yourself, but what exactly made you want to study ancient Greece history stuff?
That's a great question. So it was, I won't lie and say that, I always since childhood known that this was what I want to study. Of course, I think with a lot of people, it's like ancient Greece has always been amazing to learn about. But it kind of happened by accident. It begins with me going to my first field school. I went to the Bioarchaeology and Human Osteology field school at the Center for American Archaeology, and I can go more in depth about that experience later too. And there, my instructor was Dr. Jane Bijkstra, and she has conducted a lot of bioarchaeological research, both in the United States and the Americas, but also in Greece. And anyways, I ended up returning to the field school as an instructor, and I had many conversations with her about my thesis, and I was like, I know I'm interested in structural violence, but I have no idea where to start with this. At first, I was like, I would like to study this in a modern context, but that can be very difficult, and I had thought a lot about, well, is the research I'm doing going to be more harmful than beneficial, depending on what I'd be looking at in a modern context? And she was like, well,
why don't you apply it in a bioarchaeological context? She is the PI for the Faleron Bioarchaeological Project, and she was like, I think this could be applicable here. And so that's how I ended up studying it in archaic Greece.
Sometimes you just get handed a project, and there's nothing wrong with that.
There are questions.
I have one question, and I know Paige, you have work experience also, but Thomas, since you're finished and you're actually working in the trenches, literally. Sometimes, what is a day like for you as a professional forensic archaeologist? What do you do? What do you do on a day-to-day basis?
So the real answer is not as fun as people might hope. What forensic anthropology do I do on a day-to-day basis? None, really, is the honest answer. I don't do much with my forensic experience and what I do now. Right now, I am primarily just an archaeologist. I am working with some burials right now that will not be undergoing any analysis, so I won't get to analyze any of those remains. They're just being repatriated directly. But there's nothing wrong with that. I really enjoy doing archaeology as well. I was trained as a forensic archaeologist while I was at UT. So the methods and process is pretty similar, but I basically start at 7 o'clock every morning. I go and I hang out by a 2x1 unit, a 2 meter by 1 meter unit, and we're taking it at 10 centimeter intervals all the way down to 1 meter, and then we're doing another 1.5 meters augering down, so I think we're getting to about 250 centimeters down, and we're just looking for artifacts, for remains, mapping, doing a lot of mapping, a lot of soil profiling, and I write a whole lot of labels. I really do. It's a very romantic job. But CRM archaeology is really important. You know, I'm giving back to communities. I am working with these people's ancestors and their remains and their family and everything that goes along with that. I work really closely with the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, and they are a fantastic resource. You know, we all have some of our qualms with each other. You know, they don't want us digging up, you know, any of their remains, but it kind of has to get done. So interacting with that is really the highlight of my CRM career, is learning and working with the tribes.
And Paige, actually, I know that you're getting towards the end of your master's program, and I know that you had also mentioned that you're interested in continuing to work with repatriation and with local communities. So could you speak a little bit about what you see for yourself when you finish up?
Yes, so currently I'm still working for tribal relations at Chico State. We're rehousing and repatriating all of the ancestors as well as cultural objects that Chico State has had ownership, quote unquote, of since excavations and everything were conducted in like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, etc. And that has been a very rewarding experience to be able to help facilitate that, because I think it's necessary for anthropology moving forward that we repatriate and give back and really listen to tribal perspectives and ask how our work can best serve their interests and goals. And so after graduation, ideally I'd like to continue doing that somewhere, but I'll actually be working for the Forest Service as an archaeologist. So I hope that I'll be able to help the Forest Service with that as well, but we'll see.
So are you saying you already have a job lined up before you graduate? That's
Yes,
amazing.
yeah, it's one of the Forest Service's seasonal positions. Yeah, so if anyone's interested in like archaeology and stuff, I recommend looking for CRM jobs or like things with the Forest Service. You never know. Yeah, and in the meantime, I'm working on call for CRM, 2 different CRM firms.
Yeah. The sad reality of a forensic anthropology career trajectory is it really requires basically a doctoral degree if you're going to want to practice and work in it. You can do some stuff at a master's level, such as medical legal death investigation, autopsy technicians, things of that nature, which they're not the fanciest jobs, but they're jobs in the field. Sacramento has no support for medical legal death investigation, and I can't afford to just move somewhere that does, and I'm not living in Stockton. So it's not surprising that, you know, there's a fair amount of forensic anthropology graduates that are in archaeology, because it is a sister field, it is an important field, and you know, you don't have to have a PhD to go as far in it as you would in forensics.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And from what I understand, the trajectory for job growth in archaeology is actually quite high right now.
Yeah, the
So-
U.S. has passed several major infrastructure bills. I think California alone has like an $8 billion surplus in infrastructure. CRM jobs are on the rise, and they pay pretty well. So if you're happy being a shovel bum, a dirt monkey, like, there's nothing wrong with that.
For sure, and it's and so for those of you who are maybe thinking about that, this is the idea that you would use a degree like a master's in archaeology and anthropology to be able to go out, and you basically are there when they're putting up buildings or they're digging for foundations or laying cable or pipe, and you have to have an archaeologist on hand to be sure that you're not disturbing any cultural remains and artifacts and those. So it's environmental impact just from a cultural perspective. Lots of jobs out there for sure.
And it's really important work. That's not to understate. The work is really important, and people need to do it. I still want to be a forensic anthropologist if I get my PhD, but for the interim CRM archaeology, it's an honorable job, and I'm happy to do it.
And like we said, it doesn't have to be a linear path.
Nope.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a really good friend and colleague that is a tenure track professor in Texas at 30. So, and forensic anthropology. So there's many different ways you can go about this field.
30's really young, by the way.
30's so young. She blows my mind. Like, really, she's outstanding.
So thank you so much for joining us today. I have a couple slides, but a round of applause for our guests first.